Claire was 8 months pregnant and steps from the check-in line. She never saw the loose scaffold clamp above her, never noticed the shifting beam, or the way the ceiling groaned each time the floor shook. But Rocco did. The active-duty K9 stopped cold. His ears twitched, then he bolted. His bark sliced through the terminal noise. People turned. Claire froze mid-step, confused. She reached for her stomach. Then came the snap, steel tearing from steel, and the ceiling above her began to fall. Before we continue, make sure to subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications. Like this video if you believe dogs have a sixth sense, and drop a comment to tell us where in the world you're watching from. Claire pressed her boarding pass flat against her thigh, smoothing the paper as if the creases in it could betray her nerves. The terminal smelled of concrete dust and stale coffee, a reminder that the place was half construction site, half departure gate to 1,000 other lives. Plastic sheeting swayed overhead where scaffolding carved through the ceiling like ribs exposed. The intercom repeated delays in a monotone voice, the words dissolving into static. Claire did not hear them. Her eyes kept drifting to the folder under her arm, a thick manila pouch stuffed with letters she had not touched in years. Letters from her mother. Her other hand rested low on her belly. 8 months. Each movement inside her carried a promise and a threat. She thought of how her doctor had warned her about stress, about keeping her blood pressure steady. She had nodded politely, hiding the hospital bracelet under her sleeve, promising herself she would slow down. But how could she slow down when every step in this terminal was pulling her toward a woman she had not spoken to in over a decade? Toward a conversation that could not wait until after the baby came. The boarding pass crinkled again in her hand. Claire realized she was gripping it too tightly. She let go, but the sweat on her palm had already bled into the paper. Across the concourse, Lieutenant Avery ran a gloved hand down the fur of his partner, Rocco. The German shepherd's ears were pricked forward, his nose twitching at invisible currents in the air. Avery looked tired, the scar running along his cheek pulling taut as he scanned the ceiling. He had walked this section already. Routine sweep, nothing unusual, but Rocco was restless. The dog's nails clicked against the tiles, his tail stiff, his eyes drawn again and again to the skeletal framework above the check-in row. Easy, Avery murmured, but his voice held no conviction. He trusted Rocco's instincts more than his own eyes. Claire adjusted the strap of her bag and stepped around a puddle left by a leaking pipe. Her shoes squeaked against the slick floor. Warning tape sagged from metal posts, forming a flimsy barrier across what looked like a shortcut. She paused, glanced at the crowded main corridor, then at the taped-off path. Her back ached, her legs burned. The shortcut was tempting. She pressed her hand against her belly again and stepped across the tape. The red scaffold clamp hanging above her shoulder line barely clung to its bolt. A bead of water dripped onto it, then another. Claire did not look up. Rocco did. The shepherd stopped mid-step, his head snapping toward her. His chest expanded, air pulling deep into his lungs. Avery felt the tension in the leash a split second before Rocco's body stiffened. Claire brushed sweat from her forehead, and as she did, her sleeve pulled back. The edge of her hospital bracelet glinted under the fluorescent lights. She noticed it and tugged the sleeve down, embarrassed. A reminder she wanted no one to see. Rocco froze, staring at her as if every muscle in his body had locked. Then he let out one bark, short, sharp. It cut through the drone of announcements and the shuffle of luggage wheels. Heads turned, travelers frowned. Claire flinched, eyes darting to the dog. "Not now," she muttered, waving a dismissive hand. Her chest felt tight, but she ignored it. She had ignored worse. Rocco's ears flat. He barked again, louder this time, so loud it startled a woman spilling coffee on her blouse. Avery tugged at the leash. Rocco, but the dog was beyond commands. Claire slowed, unsure whether to retreat or press forward. Her heart thudded against her ribs. She pressed the folder of letters tighter against her chest as if they could shield her. Rocco lunged. The leash tore from Avery's hand. The shepherd sprinted across the tiles, claws scraping. Gasps erupted from passengers as the K9 barreled through the crowd. Claire's eyes widened, her hand shooting out instinctively as if to ward him off. She never saw the clamp above her give way, never saw the metal beam shift under its own weight, but she felt the floor tremble. And in that split second, just as Rocco crashed into her legs and sent her sprawling backwards onto the tiles, there was a sound that would haunt her memory long after. A snap, steel tearing from steel. The ceiling groaned as if the whole terminal exhaled at once. Claire's eyes darted upward. Dust rained down, the red clamp spun midair like a falling coin, and the beam above her began to drop. The sound was not just metal breaking. It was deeper, heavier, a vibration that ran down the spine and settled in the teeth. Claire's breath caught as she lay sprawled on the floor, Rocco's weight pinning her. She twisted her head just in time to see the beam tilt out of its socket. Passengers screamed. The sharp rattle of luggage wheels swerved against tile as people scattered. A cup of coffee arced through the air, liquid spattering before it even hit the ground. Overhead, the ceiling sagged, the plaster splitting in jagged lines that spread like cracks across ice. Claire tried to push herself up, but Rocco pressed harder against her chest, his bark erupting again and again, each blast echoing like an alarm no one had programmed into the airport system. His paws dug into her shoulder. His eyes locked on hers, urgent, unyielding. "Get off," she gasped, one hand instinctively flying to her belly. Her baby kicked hard in response, a jolt that made her wince. Her hospital bracelet slipped free of her sleeve again, dangling loosely as her wrist flailed against the floor. The beam tore loose. It came down with a force that shook the tiled ground. Dust exploded in a gray wave, filling mouths, eyes, lungs. The clamp that had held it snapped away and clattered beside Claire's outstretched hand, red paint chipping as it spun in place before falling still. Avery lunged forward, his boots skidding across the slick tiles. He yanked Claire by the arm, dragging her back even as Rocco shifted his body to shield her from the debris. Chunks of plaster and insulation rained down, slamming against the floor where she had been standing seconds before. The air turned thick, choking, lights flickered overhead, someone shouted for security, a woman wailed, children cried, Claire's chest burned as she coughed, eyes watering. She looked down and saw her boarding pass lying half buried in dust, the ink blurred, the edges curling as if the paper itself were crumbling under the weight of the moment. "Stay down," Avery's voice cut through the chaos, sharp and commanding. He crouched low beside her, one arm shielding his own head, the other gripping her elbow. Rocco growled, his body taut, his ears flattened against the roar of collapsing scaffolding. Claire wanted to move, but her legs shook violently. Her folder of letters had spilled across the floor, envelopes fluttering in the artificial wind stirred by falling debris. One slid beneath a pile of cracked plaster. She reached toward it instinctively, her fingertips brushing the torn edge, but another crash overhead made her recoil. The terminal had turned into a storm of dust and screams. Travelers sprinted toward open exits, dragging their rolling suitcases behind them like anchors. A security guard shouted into his radio, but his words were drowned out by the groaning structure. Avery pulled Claire backward again. "On your feet now," her knees buckled as she rose, the weight of her body doubled by the life inside her. Rocco circled once, then darted toward the scattering crowd, barking furiously. He stopped near a family clutching one another and barked again as if herding them toward a safer path. Avery cursed under his breath and grabbed Claire's arm tighter. "You need to move," he said, his voice low and urgent, his eyes catching hers through the haze. "He's not barking at you anymore, he's clearing a path." Claire's mouth opened, but no words came, her throat was dry. Her hand instinctively found the hospital bracelet again, squeezing it, grounding herself in the plastic band that marked her as fragile as someone who should not even be here. A sharp crack above made both of them look up. Another clamp, smaller, this one silver, popped loose from a joint in the scaffolding. The sound was like a pistol shot. Rocco barked again, louder than before. He spun and sprinted back toward them, his fur dusted with falling plaster. Avery's face went pale. "He's warning us again, it's not over." Claire followed his gaze upward. The scaffold stretched across the terminal ceiling like a skeleton, bolts glinting in the flickering lights. One by one, the clamps looked weaker, looser. The whole structure groaned as if it were alive, breathing its last. Her pulse hammered in her ears. She staggered backward, her foot slipping on a torn boarding pass that was not hers. She stumbled, nearly falling, but Avery caught her. The letter she had carried spilled completely across the tiles now, envelopes torn open by boots rushing past. Claire wanted to grab them all, to hold onto the only bridge she still had to her mother. But her belly tightened, a sharp pain rippling across her abdomen. Her knees buckled again. Rocco skidded to a stop in front of her, barking madly. His eyes flicked between her and the ceiling. He crouched low, bracing himself. Avery cursed again, looking around wildly. "The whole section's coming down," he muttered. His grip on Claire's arm tightened until it hurt. Another metallic snap split the air. And then came silence, a pause so unnatural it felt like the terminal itself was holding its breath. Dust drifted like snowflakes in the stillness. Claire dared to look up. A massive beam groaned above, bending under its own weight. Bolts sheared off one by one, sparks flickering as metal tore against metal. The ceiling was about to give way entirely. Claire clutched her stomach, gasping. Rocco planted himself between her and the beam, his body rigid, his bark echoing again and again into the hollow silence. And then the beam shifted, the full weight starting to plunge directly toward them. The beam lurched. Its descent was not swift like a guillotine, but dreadful, groaning, a slow-motion fall that gave enough time for terror to bloom in every face turned upward. Screams tore through the haze. Luggage was abandoned mid-roll. Parents yanked children into their arms, shielding them with bodies that knew they might not be enough. Claire's breath caught, her ribs straining against the weight of panic and the life pressing from within her belly. She stumbled back, but her legs felt trapped in water, heavy and unresponsive. Avery's grip on her arm tightened, trying to drag her toward the nearest support column. But Rocco made the choice for them. The German shepherd lunged forward, slamming his shoulder into Claire's thigh. The force knocked her sideways, spinning her out of the beam's path. Her hospital bracelet snagged on Avery's sleeve, snapping tight across her skin, cutting into her wrist before tearing free with a sting. The white band dangled loose, half-torn as she hit the floor again. The beam slammed down where she had been. The sound was like thunder in a closed box, deafening final. Dust erupted in a choking storm, blotting out the overhead lights until the terminal became a world of gray and shadows. Claire's ears rang. She could not hear her own gasps, only the deep echo of Rocco's bark piercing through the haze. She coughed violently, eyes streaming as she crawled on hands and knees across the cracked tiles. Her palm landed on something soft, one of the envelopes. The paper tore beneath her grip, a corner dissolving in the damp grit of spilled water and plaster. Her heart screamed to grab the rest, to gather the letters she had carried this far. But another crack above made her snap her head upward. More scaffolding shifted, a ripple traveling across the skeletal frame like a wave preparing to crash. "Move," Avery's voice finally cut through, ragged but sharp. He pulled her up again, his own face pale with dust, streaked by the sweat carving paths down his cheeks. He shoved her toward the nearest emergency exit sign, its green glow flickering through the haze, but Claire froze. A child's cry pierced through the chaos, high, shrill, desperate. She turned and saw them, a little girl clutching a stuffed rabbit, her father dragging her but falling behind as a tide of panicked passengers surged past. The girl tripped, the rabbit slipping from her grasp. She wailed, frozen, unable to move as the ceiling above her groaned again. Rocco heard it too. He bounded toward the sound, slipping between fleeing legs, his bark erupting like a beacon. Avery cursed, torn between pulling Claire to safety and following his dog. Claire's voice cracked. The child, Avery, did not hesitate. "Stay behind me." He dragged her forward, but his eyes were locked on Rocco. The shepherd reached the girl in seconds, circling her, barking furiously to hold back the stampede of feet rushing around her. He planted himself over the stuffed rabbit, his tail stiff, his body low and protective. The child sobbed, reaching for the toy, and Rocco nosed it back into her arms before nudging her toward her father with a forceful push of his shoulder. But in that moment of salvation, danger deepened. A section of the ceiling directly above them sagged, bolts popping like gunfire. Claire's eyes widened. "It's coming down on them," she screamed, her voice raw. Avery shoved her hard toward the exit, nearly toppling her. "Go," he sprinted toward Rocco and the child, his scarred face vanishing into the dust. Claire staggered, torn between self-preservation and the unbearable pull of watching. Her boarding pass fluttered from her pocket, spinning into the dust like a surrender flag. She gasped, one hand on her belly, the other reaching after Avery, though she had no strength to follow. The ceiling gave way. It happened in a cascade, one joint snapping, then another, until the weight of steel and plaster surrendered to gravity. The air filled with the shriek of tearing metal and the concussive roar of impact. Claire dropped to her knees, covering her head, her lungs searing with dust. She could not see Rocco, she could not see Avery. Only shadows flailing in the storm of collapse. Her fingers closed tight around the torn hospital bracelet still dangling from her wrist. She whispered through the dust, "Please." She did not know to whom. To her mother, to her unborn child, to the dog who had thrown himself into ruin for strangers. The ground shuddered again. A second beam tilted. Claire's eyes darted upward in horror. She realized with icy clarity that the collapse was not finished. The entire scaffolding was about to chain react, every bolt a fuse, every beam a bomb waiting to fall. And Rocco was still in the center of it. The second beam shuddered overhead like a predator deciding where to strike. Dust billowed in waves, rolling across the concourse and turning people into gray phantoms stumbling toward the exits. Claire's throat burned with each breath, her eyes streaming as she tried to make sense of the chaos. But all she could see, all she could think of, was the silhouette of Rocco in the storm. The shepherd's bark cut through the din like a lifeline, short, sharp, relentless. Each bark carried urgency, an unshakable command to move, to run, to survive. He had guided the little girl back to her father, nudging them toward safety, but he had not followed. He was still there. Still in the collapse zone. Claire forced herself onto her feet, her knees quaking. The torn hospital bracelet clung to her wrist like a shackle, sticky with sweat and dust. Her hand pressed against her belly, feeling the sharp kick of her baby, a pulse of life reminding her that every second she stayed frozen was another risk too great. Then she saw Avery. He burst from the haze, one arm shielding his face, the other clutching a section of fractured ceiling tile he tossed aside with a grunt. His voice broke through the chaos, hoarse but fierce. "Claire, keep moving," but she shook her head, coughing. Rocco, Avery's jaw tightened. His eyes cut toward the shepherd, still barking at the falling beams as if he could warn the ceiling into holding, and then it gave. The second beam snapped, tearing loose with a shriek that rattled the terminal's steel bones. It fell sideways, smashing into a row of check-in counters. Screens exploded in sparks, baggage belts buckled and split. The impact sent a fresh blast of dust and shards of plastic whipping through the air. Rocco darted at the last second, weaving between collapsing debris with a precision born of instinct and training. His fur was streaked white with plaster, his body a blur as he dodged what should have crushed him. But the danger was not finished. The collapse spread. One beam triggered another. The scaffolding groaned like a wounded giant, each connection surrendering in sequence. Red clamps spun loose in the air, raining down like shattered toys. One landed inches from Claire's hand, the paint scratched raw, the metal twisted. She stared at it, her breath shallow, the symbol of failure clattering at her feet. Her folder of letters still lay scattered, half buried beneath dust. She saw one envelope flutter upward in the turbulence, caught in an invisible current before it disappeared into the gray void. Her chest clenched, her mother's words slipping further away with every second. Rocco barked again, louder, sharper, until it hurt her ears even through the ringing in her head. He was not calling Avery now, not calling the crowd. His amber eyes locked on Claire, and in that unbroken stare she understood he was calling her. Move, her body obeyed. She stumbled forward, clutching Avery's arm as he pulled her through the drifting haze toward a side corridor, but each step away widened the distance between her and the dog. Come on, Avery bellowed, his voice shredding in the dust. He coughed hard, pulling his shirt up over his mouth. His scarred cheek was streaked with grit. Claire hesitated, twisting back. He's not following, and then she saw why. Rocco had stopped. His body was rigid, ears forward, tail stiff. His paws pressed hard against the tile, his entire frame angled toward the structure above. He barked furiously, warning them again, but also anchoring himself. His gaze flicked between the scaffolding and the fleeing people, then back to Claire. He was holding position, choosing to be the alarm. No, Claire's cry tore out of her throat, raw and desperate. Her vision blurred with tears. She yanked at Avery's grip, but he held firm, his own face tight with grief. The ceiling cracked wider. Huge slabs of plaster sagged, then broke, plummeting into the terminal with bone-rattling thuds. Metal bars twisted and fell like spears. A section of scaffolding tilted, its end driving into the tiles with a sound like an explosion. Sparks rained as power lines ripped free, plunging half the terminal into shadow. Claire stumbled, her knees hitting the floor. Her torn bracelet dangled, dust-caked and half-broken. Her baby kicked hard again, and she pressed her palm against her stomach, sobbing. She was alive, but only because Rocco had forced her to be, and Rocco was still in the kill zone. Avery crouched beside her, gripping her shoulder. Listen to me, that dog knows what he's doing. He's trained for this, he's holding the line. His voice cracked on the last word. The haunted survivor mask he wore was slipping, revealing the man underneath, terrified of losing the only partner he trusted. Claire shook her head violently. No training can stop steel. Her voice broke into coughing fits. She wiped at her face, smearing tears and dust. She wanted to scream louder, but her lungs betrayed her. Rocco barked again, but his voice was nearly drowned out by the roar of another section tearing free. The ceiling lurched, beams groaning, clamps popping in a chain reaction. The floor shivered beneath Claire's knees. The entire structure was seconds away from total collapse. Avery's hand squeezed her shoulder so hard it hurt. We can't stay, but Claire's eyes were fixed on Rocco. Through the haze, his silhouette was etched against the falling ruin, unyielding, barking with the force of something greater than instinct. Not just warning, not just protocol. It was defiance, a refusal to let this end without his mark. The final beam above him groaned, its bolts screeched as they tore loose one by one. Claire's heart pounded so violently it drowned the noise, her nails dug into the floor tiles. Rocco, she screamed, her voice ragged, shattering the air, and in that moment the beam snapped free, tilting toward him with deadly certainty. Claire's scream was swallowed by the collapse as the weight of steel hurtled down. The beams thundered down. The impact split the air with such violence that Claire thought her heart had ruptured inside her chest. The sound was not a single crash, but a chain reaction, steel on steel, plaster exploding, glass shattering. The concourse roared like a battlefield. Claire screamed until her throat tore raw, dust surged, choking her. The world became gray static. She could not see, she could not breathe, she could not think beyond the horror of knowing that Rocco had stood where the beam had fallen. Her hands clawed at the tiles, scraping skin, searching for any sign, fur, movement, anything. Avery's arm locked around her shoulders, pulling her back, forcing her down. His voice was harsh in her ear, broken by coughing. Stay low, stay down. I can't, Claire sobbed, fighting his grip, her belly pressed painfully against the floor. She curled protectively around it, her unborn child kicking in terrified spasms. The hospital bracelet, half torn, cut into her wrist as she twisted against Avery's hold. But then, a bark. Muffled, choked, but alive, Claire froze, her head snapped toward the ruin. Through the dust and sparks she caught it, the faint, staggering silhouette of Rocco dragging himself from under a collapsed panel. His fur was matted white with plaster, one ear flattened, but his body was still moving, still fighting. Rocco, Avery's voice cracked for the first time, not a command, not protocol, pure desperation. The shepherd staggered, coughed dust from his lungs, and barked again. His amber eyes locked on Claire and Avery, glowing like embers through the haze. He pushed forward, limping but unyielding, weaving between shattered beams that could still crush him if the rest gave way. Claire's tears blurred her sight, but her chest filled with a wild, defiant hope. He was alive. He had not given in, he was clawing his way out of the ruin because he refused to leave her unfinished. Avery hauled her upward, slinging her arm over his shoulder. We move now, follow him. The path ahead was chaos. Smoke alarm lights flickered red, casting the dust into a blood-colored haze. Passengers surged toward the exits, many limping, some carrying others. The air reeked of ozone and crushed concrete. Overhead, the scaffolding groaned again, threatening to fall completely, the final collapse imminent. Rocco barked furiously, guiding them. He darted left, then backtracked, hurting them away from a falling section that slammed down behind them, sparks bursting from broken wires. Avery followed without hesitation, trusting every move. Claire stumbled, her legs trembling, her hand clutching her belly with each jolt. Her foot landed on something soft. She glanced down through the dust. An envelope. One of her mother's letters, edges burned from sparks, half covered in plaster. She bent instinctively, scooping it up. The paper tore, smearing ink into her palm. She did not stop. She shoved it into her pocket, clutching it like a talisman. They pushed forward, coughing, lungs burning. Rocco barked again and charged through a narrow gap where scaffolding had crumpled but not yet fallen. Avery shoved Claire through, then squeezed himself after. The space behind them collapsed seconds later, sealing the path with a deafening crash. Claire gasped, clutching the wall. Her legs threatened to give out, but Rocco was there, pressing against her thigh, steadying her, his fur warm beneath the dust. She buried a trembling hand in his coat, tears mixing with grit. "You saved me," she whispered, though the roar of chaos almost swallowed her words. Rocco looked up at her, panting, ears flicking toward the ceiling. Another groan rumbled through the terminal, louder, deeper. The entire structure was ready to come down. They had seconds. "Move," Avery snapped, tugging her. His own face was gray with ash, his scar streaked with sweat. His eyes burned with urgency, but also something softer, a flicker of awe as he looked at Rocco. "He'll get us out, trust him," and she did. Rocco sprinted ahead, leaping over debris, pausing only to bark when the path split. His instincts were flawless. He could feel the vibrations, sense the tension in the beams, smell the weakness before eyes could see it. He led them through the maze of ruin, past fallen signs, shattered benches, and trails of abandoned boarding passes littering the ground like discarded dreams. At last, the emergency exit. The green sign flickered through the haze like a beacon. A group of passengers pressed against it, shoving through into the night air. Rocco lunged ahead, barking sharply, clearing a path. Avery pulled Claire with every ounce of strength left in him. Her lungs screamed, her belly cramped. But the sight of that door filled her with enough fire to push one step further, then another. They burst through into the open night. Cold air slapped Claire's face, cutting through the heat of dust and panic. Floodlights illuminated the tarmac, where emergency vehicles had gathered in chaos, sirens blaring, paramedics sprinting. The roar of the collapse still thundered behind them, but here under the open sky it was distant, muffled, survivable. Claire collapsed onto the pavement, gasping. Her belly contracted sharply. She doubled over, clutching herself, sobbing with exhaustion and terror. The torn hospital bracelet dangled loosely, the word maternity smeared and nearly unreadable. A medic knelt beside her immediately, shouting for a stretcher. Avery stumbled to the ground beside her, coughing so hard his body shook. His eyes never left Rocco. The shepherd stood in the open, chest heaving, fur ghost white with plaster, but his head held high. He scanned the crowd, ears twitching, eyes sharp even in exhaustion. His bark had quieted, but his presence roared louder than any siren. He had been the alarm, the shield, the reason they were alive. Claire reached for him with trembling fingers. Rocco padded forward, pressing his head into her palm. She sobbed, stroking his fur, leaving streaks of dust and blood. You held it together," she whispered, her voice broken. "You held me together." Rocco licked her wrist, right where the bracelet had torn. Hours later, after the chaos settled and the fires were put out, Claire sat on a stretcher, wrapped in a blanket. Her folder of letters was gone, lost to the collapse except for the single torn envelope in her pocket. She held it tightly, the ink blurred but the weight of it real. Avery approached, Rocco at his side, both of them freshly bandaged, both of them weary. He crouched, meeting her eyes. "You'll want to know something," he said, voice softer now. "That dog, he's trained to read shifts in structures. He can hear what we can't, smell the strain before it breaks, but today he wasn't just reacting to the ceiling. He was reacting to you." Claire blinked through tears. "Me?" Avery nodded. His gaze shifted to the hospital bracelet still dangling from her wrist. He knew, the stress, the danger, the way you were holding yourself. He understood you were carrying more than just yourself. That's why he broke protocol. That's why he barked at you. He wasn't going to let you fall. Claire's lips trembled. She clutched the bracelet, her other hand pressing against her belly. A soft kick answered. She smiled through tears, whispering to her child, "We made it, because of him." Months later, in a quiet hospital room, Claire held her newborn daughter against her chest. The baby's fist curled tightly around her finger, tiny and fierce. Claire kissed the soft crown of her head and whispered her name, Ava Rocco. The letters to her mother were gone, but this letter, this living one, would carry the message instead. Proof that a bark louder than collapse had held her future together. And somewhere in the memory of steel and dust, that bark still echoed. What do you feel after hearing this story? Imagine the weight of that moment, one bark deciding a future. Because of Rocco, both mother and baby walked away with hope still in their arms.